In my previous video, linked in the description below, I discussed how morality is ultimately about value judgment, and value is inherently subjective. What we call good is simply what we consider valuable, while bad is what we see as the opposite. This means that good and bad are always relative to what we value, and what we value is, by nature, subjective. Many Christians would disagree with this perspective. They argue that their moral standards isn't based on personal values, but on God's values, making it objective, unchanging, and divinely mandated. For them, even if every human being agreed that torturing babies for fun was acceptable, it would still be objectively wrong because God, not people, sets the standard. Christians believe they don't follow their own hearts, they submit to God's will. I see it differently. In this video, I'll explain why Christians, like everyone else, use subjective reasoning in their moral judgment, even if they don't realize it. In fact, the most devout believers often determine what is good or evil based on their own desires and preferences, and then retroactively attribute those values to God. Hello, my friends. I'm Shen, and welcome to Mindful Living. This channel isn't about convincing religious people to abandon their faith. Instead, it's about encouraging everyone, believers and non-believers alike, to be more mindful of their personal beliefs. If you think it's valuable to examine your own viewpoints and refine them when necessary, then this video is for you. But if you are certain you already have everything figured out and there's no room for growth, then congratulations, I envy your confidence. Still, I encourage you to watch, and if you spot any flaws in my reasoning, let me know. Now, when I say that Christians use subjective value judgments in their faith, I'm not saying that's inherently bad. In fact, it's not. I acknowledge that I also use subjective standards to judge right from wrong. The real issue isn't subjectivity itself, it's failing to recognize that this is what's happening. So by the end of this video, if you find my arguments convincing, you won't need to change your beliefs, you won't need to abandon your moral framework. The only thing I ask is that you acknowledge how your beliefs and practices ultimately stem from your own personal values and goals. Before we dive into how theists, like everyone else, rely on subjectively moral reasoning, let's address a major misconception: the belief that subjective morality is inherently bad and something to be avoided. Christians and others who believe in objective morality often assume that if moral decisions are based on subjective desires and goals, there is no guarantee that a person will stay committed to them. After all, they argue, there is no obligation to follow one's own desires. They believe that if moral values were objectively true, people would naturally stick to them. But this couldn't be further from the truth. They might ask, why do you care whether babies are tortured if morality has no objective basis? My answer is simple. I care because I deeply desire to see babies thrive and human society flourish. It is true that my desires have no objective or external foundation, but that doesn't mean I can simply abandon it or change my mind at will. Pointing out that my desire is subjective, even arbitrary, won't make me stop caring about human well-being. It just doesn't work that way. If I feel strongly about something, I will act on it. Nothing motivates people more than a genuine desire to see something happen. If you ask professional musicians why they chose their career, most will say they love music, find it fulfilling, or simply enjoy it. Their passion is what drives them. Now imagine asking them, do you base your love for music on some objective, independent truth? If not, how can you sustain it? If it's all subjective, why not just give it up? They would look at you like you're crazy. It's a ridiculous question. The same applies to morality. I have a strong desire to be a decent person, someone who cares not just about my own well-being, but also about others. Supporting my family and community brings me joy. Seeing people receive the help they need makes me happy. So if I witness a baby being tortured, I will do everything in my power to stop it. Not because I am bound by some objective moral law, but because I have empathy. The very thought of such cruelty makes me cringe, and that feeling compels me to act. Could my empathy be grounded in some universal, timeless moral truth? Maybe, but I don't need to believe that in order to act on it. The same is true for Christians. They claim that God is the source of eternal, transcendent moral truths, and this is why we should follow them. But they overlook a crucial step. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that objective moral facts do exist and that they are rooted in God's nature. What makes God's nature normative? Something that obligates Christians to follow it. This process isn't automatic. Saying God is just, therefore justice is a virtue is fine. But so what? That fact alone doesn't create an obligation to act justly. A person still needs to feel the desire to align their actions with those moral facts before they actually do so. It's entirely possible for someone to recognize an objective moral truth, yet still refuse to follow it, either because they don't care or because they outright reject divine authority. The well-known atheist Dan Barker has said that even if he were convinced that Christian God were real, he would still choose hell over accepting God's moral judgment, because he considers the Christian God to be evil.
If there is a hell, and if the atheists get to the end of their life and discover, yep, I was wrong, there is a God, this is counterfactual, this is not that I actually believe it, then you are right. I would then believe and know that there's a God, but that does not mean I would respect or admire a God who would create something like a hell to send someone like me to. And my beloved mother, Patsy Barker, who died as an atheist with a smile on her face, happy that she lived a good life raising 3 good boys. That deity is torturing her in hell, and Mark Twain, and George Gershwin, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Aaron Copland, and Johannes Brahms, and Prokofiev, Margaret Sanger, Bertrand Russell, Carl Sagan, wonderful people who lived these lives. You're telling me that the God you love and admire has consigned us to eternal torture? Then I would say to that God, if you created hell, you go to hell. And if you want to torture me forever, fine. You prove what a big macho man you are. You do not have my respect.
It doesn't matter that this God supposedly determines what is objectively moral. Dan Barker is prepared to reject those moral laws because they do not align with his personal values. He finds no joy in following them. This position isn't unthinkable. We all live under legal systems with established laws, but that doesn't stop some people from breaking them. People may be fully aware of the laws yet choose to disregard them because they find them unreasonable, or they are desperate, or they just don't care. The point is that simply knowing a law exists doesn't guarantee obedience. If Christians want others to follow God's moral laws, simply stating that absolute moral truths exist isn't enough. People don't just need to believe in objective moral rules, they need to want to follow them. But if someone already has moral intuitions that lead them to act ethically, that alone is enough. There is no need to convince them that the moral values they already hold are objectively true in order for them to follow their conscience. Why do Christians value obedience to God? It's not just because obeying God is supposedly objectively moral. It's because the outcomes of obedience align with their desires. For Dan Barker, recognizing an objective moral standard is one thing. Choosing to follow it is another. There has to be an additional motivation that compels a person to obey those moral laws. I would argue that many Christians don't actually care about following objective moral laws for their own sake. What they care about is the reward that comes with obedience, eternal life in heaven, and avoiding the punishment of hell. In the Christian worldview, it's not enough for God to simply declare his moral laws and expect people to follow them. He has to incentivize obedience, and the most effective incentives are those that tap into human desires. People are drawn to the idea of eternal bliss, and they fear the thought of everlasting torment. That's how the Christian God secures devotion. Even he knows that humans are driven by subjective desires, particularly the pursuit of pleasures and the avoidance of suffering. Or perhaps it wasn't God, but religious authorities who crafted these promises and threats. But that's a discussion for another time. Even so, these incentives don't always work. The promise of heaven and the fear of hell aren't enough to keep everyone in line. We have already seen Dan Barker, a man who openly rejects God's moral standards despite knowing the consequences. But even among believers, the incentive of heaven sometimes fails. Christians and theists in general are not universally known for being the most moral people. They still engage in behaviors they believe God condemns. Why? Because sometimes their desire to sin outweighs their desire to obey. That's why we constantly hear about scandals involving priests and pastors. The temptations of power, money, and sex can at times override even a sincere desire to please God. This is why Christians are often accused of hypocrisy. Their private actions don't always align with the values they publicly preach. Now, imagine if God removed the rewards and punishments from the equation. What would happen? Many Christians would suddenly find little motivation to follow his commands. No sex before marriage? Without consequences, good luck convincing believers to value chastity. Of course, this doesn't mean they would abandon all divine mandates. They would still follow some, but likely because they already agree with them. Most people don't need God to tell them that murder is wrong. They believe that on their own. Even if they stopped believing in God, they wouldn't suddenly feel the urge to go on a killing spree. Some Christians might argue that obeying God isn't about earning a ticket to heaven. It's about accepting that God alone defines what is right and wrong. From their perspective, God is the most powerful being in existence and holds the highest authority. But even in this scenario, they are still making a judgment. They are deciding that the most powerful being in the universe has the right to tell them how to think and act. In doing so, they are subscribing to a value system known as might makes right. But does might make right? If you say, when it comes to God, yes, might makes right, then that is a subjective judgment. You follow God's moral standards because you personally accept that his power entitles him to dictate morality. But if you don't accept that might makes right, then what else compels you to submit to God? There must be a subjective reason. The real question is not whether you have a subjective reason, but whether you are aware of it. Being a moral subjectivist doesn't mean I believe all moral views are equally valid or that everyone should have the right to act on their values without restriction. If someone's actions threaten what I deeply value, I'm not going to just sit back and say it's okay. I will actively try to stop them. This isn't a difficult concept to grasp. If someone wants to kill my family, I'm not going to open the door and let them in. I will do everything in my power to stop them. Not because I believe my moral values are objectively true and therefore I have the right to impose them, but because protecting my family is a core value of mine. I want them to live happily, and I would even risk my own life to keep them safe. If I were to simply step aside and let the murderers in, what would that say about my values? Wouldn't that call into question whether I truly care about my family's well-being? So when I oppose someone's harmful actions, it's not because I think my values are objectively right and theirs are objectively wrong. It's because I am exercising my own moral convictions. Does that mean I will resort to violence every time someone disagrees with me? Of course not. Disagreements happen all the time, but there are many ways to address them. The most obvious approach is persuasion. We try to understand the other person's desires and goals, then show them how their intended actions may not actually align with those goals. Ideally, they change their mind, not because they now see my moral standards are objective, but because they recognize that their own values and actions were misaligned. In many cases, moral disagreements don't stem from different values, but from misinformation. When people are presented with accurate facts, they often reach common ground. And when persuasion fails after honest communication, that doesn't necessarily mean force is the next step. We can still agree to disagree. as long as in practicing their values they do not actively undermine ours. Most Christians handle moral disagreements in a similar way. They don't typically go around demanding that others submit to God's will as they understand it. Some do, of course, particularly evangelical Christians who insist that non-Christians should refrain from abortion simply because it's against God's will, completely disregarding the fact that non-Christians don't believe in their God. But many Christians recognize that this kind of rhetoric won't persuade non-believers. Instead, they argue that abortion is murder. And since even non-Christians oppose murder, they should logically oppose abortion as well. Rather than relying on religious authority, they attempt to expose inconsistencies in pro-choice ethics, hoping that this will prompt reconsideration. That approach makes sense. That's why I find it amusing when Christians ask, if you don't believe in objective moral facts, how do you critique other cultures' practices like female genital mutilation? It's as if they think merely appealing to objective moral truths will convince others to change their minds. But that's not how persuasion works, and they know it. Yet, for some reason, that common sense seems to escape them when they criticize moral subjectivism. I don't have a problem with people claiming that morality is objective. My real issue is with those who disguise their subjective moral values as objective ones. They feel justified in imposing their values on others because they believe their moral intuitions reflect universal, transcendent truth. To put it bluntly, I think that's narcissistic. And I don't use that word lightly because I believe narcissism is at the heart of many problems Christianity and some other monotheistic beliefs, in their present forms, brings to the world. The conviction that one holds objective moral truth is just one of its symptoms. Even when Christians appeal to the Bible as the unchanging foundation of their ethics, they are still filtering it through their own subjective interpretation. That's why they disagree on so many moral issues, while each insisting they represent God's will. Ask 3 Christians whether slavery in the Old Testament was objectively moral, and you will get 3 different answers. Ask whether a wife can divorce an abusive husband, and the answer depends entirely on which denomination you ask. And ask whether Donald Trump is being a good president. Well, let's not open that can of worms. Surprisingly, though, a large number of American Christians seem to agree that he is a man after God's own heart. My point is that even if objective moral truth exists, humans are unreliable messengers of those truths. That's why no one should feel entitled to tell others they must follow a particular moral standard, because we always communicate through the lens of our own subjectivity. Christians need to take this issue more seriously and develop a little more humility. Of course, that depends on whether they even think narcissism is bad. If they don't, they can ignore my advice. And that's fine by me. Like I said at the beginning, I believe morality is subjective. What I consider good or bad depends on the goals I set for myself. As members of the same social species, I assume we share fundamental values such as minimizing harm, promoting human flourishing, and seeking truth. So when I say you should do this or that, I am not imposing my standards on you. I am suggesting that this course of action likely aligns with your own core values, and here is why. Reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, etc. I believe this is what effective communication looks like, finding common ground to create a win-win situation. It's not about dominance, superiority, or treating morality like a zero-sum game. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you found value in this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.